The game of chess has 6 different kinds of pieces. It's played on 64 squares. We're going to go one at a time. We can't make you Picasso until we make you a finger painter. Let's clear the board. This first piece is the rook. The rook can travel up. He can go down, left and right. Very simple. The rook moves in any straight line. The rook captures by simply running into a piece. So if we put this enemy pawn on g5, notice we say the letter and then the number, the rook can simply slide over, land on top of the pawn, take it off the board. Can the rook capture this enemy pawn? Of course not, but in 2 moves it can. The rook can travel up to g7, and then on the next turn, if the pawn is silly and just sitting there, what are you doing, pawn? The rook can capture. You could, of course, also go to the left and on the next turn, travel up to capture the pawn. Let's learn the next piece. This one is called the bishop. The bishop moves along the diagonals of the board, much like the rook. It could travel just 1 square if it feels like it, or it could go to some sort of in-between amount, or all the way to the edge of the chessboard. If we draw arrows to every single square the bishop can move to along the diagonals, you're going to count, if you do it carefully, 13 squares. I hope you're not afraid of that number. The bishop has all of those options. Notice, if the bishop is on a dark square, it must stay on the dark squares for the rest of the game. The blue square, e5, if it travels, it's on a blue square, another blue square. If the bishop wants to capture something, it simply runs into it, a lot like the rook. So if the bishop wants to capture this pawn, the bishop runs into it and takes it off the board. One funny thing, if this pawn was on a light square, the bishop could never capture it. It has the cloak of invisibility. The bishop could travel here, and then here, and then here, and all the while the pawn is teasing the bishop. Let's move on and learn the next piece. The queen. She's quite simple but powerful. If you could somehow melt a rook and a bishop together, well, your alchemy would produce a queen. The queen has the power of the rook and the bishop combined. So that means she can go up and down like a rook, left and right like a rook, and of course diagonal like a bishop, and she makes a very pretty snowflake on the chessboard if you happen to be a 5-year-old and thinking in terms of those shapes. The queen can travel to every one of those squares. There's actually 27 of them, and much like the rook or the bishop, she simply captures by running into a piece. Now, if I have a pawn over here on this square, the queen would have many ways to get there in 2 moves. She could go sideways and then down. She could go diagonal and then up. She could even go a little crazy and go diagonal the opposite way and then sideways to capture. I have not named all of them. If you want to try to find a few more on your own, well, go for it. But I'm going to move on and teach you the 4th piece. This old guy here, that's the king. He's kind of like your grandpa. He can still get around, but he doesn't travel very quickly. The king moves 1 square any direction. That means up or down or left or right or diagonal, but again, only 1 square. He's got a little bit of a force field around him, but that is it. Now, the king has a special importance, which we will get to later, but just to show you how slow the king is, if we put the king down here on the 1st rank, that's what we call our side-to-side rows, and we put a queen right beside the king, and we have a race to the other side of the board, well, it's not going to turn out like the tortoise and the hare. The king would travel 1 square, and then if it was the queen's turn, the queen could get there all in 1 turn. You can see it's going to take the king 7 different turns to get all the way to the other side. He's actually not a very powerful piece. We have 2 pieces remaining. The little guy, we've already named him. He's called the pawn, and you get more pawns than any other chess piece. He's little, but he's important. The pawn can only travel 1 square forward to the square e6, and on the next turn, e7. Now, the pawn does have some very special exceptions. All of the pawns for white will begin on rank number 2. I'm not going to add all of them there. I'm just going to add 4 of them to save time because we're trying to get all this game of chess learned in 15 minutes. So, if a pawn is on the starting row, which for white is the 2nd rank, it has the option of going 1 square forward or 2 squares forward. However, after you leave the home base, you can only go 1 square for the rest of the game. So this pawn on e2, it could go to e3 or e4. On the next turn, it has to go to e5, 1 square for the rest of the game. However, if white wanted to move the pawn on d2, that pawn would have the option of 1 or 2 because it's on home base. Pawns are also the only piece in chess that capture a different way than they move. Let's add some black pawns to make this game a little bit more interesting. And if white just moved the pawn from e2 to e4, it would be black's turn. Black might do the symmetrical move, pawn on e7 to e5. Now this white pawn is actually stuck. It's not because you did anything wrong. Pawns get stuck all the time. Pawns do not capture straightforward. They have to wait until there's another piece diagonally one square away. Of course, there's nothing on those squares and you can't capture a bunch of blank air. However, later in the game, let's just say white moves this pawn one square and black decides to move this pawn two squares. Well, that would be a mistake for black. Now, white pawn can capture by going one square diagonal and overtaking the square the black pawn is on. And if black is having a particularly bad day and pushes this pawn one square forward, white could, of course, capture again. Pawns move forward, but they capture diagonal. Couple more special moves about the pawn that we will learn a little bit later on. We've got one final piece, though, before we can put them all on the board and learn where they start. This last piece is the knight. Don't call it a horse. It hurts my ears when you say that. The knight moves 1, 2, stops, makes a turn, and moves one more. And if we were to fill in these squares with red boxes, you would see the shape of the capital L. So many people say the knight moves in the shape of an L. But the knight doesn't just have the ability to move to this square. It could also move 1, 2, turn, and make a backward L. That's another option. Okay, let's add a few more. We've already set F3 and D3. The knight could also move up 2 and over 1, up 2 and over 1 the other way. The knight could also move sideways and then up, sideways and then down, always moving 1, 2 turn. And you can probably figure out the completion of this pattern. Drum roll, please. I don't know if we got a drum roll, but knight can go to c4. Those are the 8 different squares the knight can move to. Now, one trick about the knight, unlike the bishop, the knight always changes colors. The knight's on a blue square, we call it a dark square. If it moves 1, 2 turn, it's on a light square. 1, 2 turn, a dark square, 1, 2 turn, a light square. And if you don't believe me, well, keep moving the knight and eventually you'll get it. The knight has a special power that no other piece has. The knight can jump over things. It only captures when it lands on something. If I put a black pawn on f6, the knight could jump over that pawn just like it's not even there. 1, 2, turn, and it completely ignores the pawn. Now, if the black pawn moves forward 1 square, the knight could move 1, 2, turn, and because it landed on the pawn, that's how the knight captures. The knight can jump over anything, its own pieces, the enemy pieces, kings, rooks, bishops, other knights, but it can only capture pieces that it lands on.